So clearly people are going to be clicking on this video to be triggered, to want to start an argument. What this video is for is just to kind of highlight certain things about this particular album. Right from the get-go, I don't like The Wall. I don't like Pink Floyd's The Wall as much as everybody else. And I think that's the main caveat of this. It's not that necessarily The Wall is a bad album. I'm not coming out to shit all over The Wall. I am here to just kind of give my own opinion about why it is that The Wall never really resonated with me all that much. Which is odd because a lot of the concepts and themes that are found on this is a very human concept at the end of the day. It's very relatable. So yeah, I'm also kind of here to kind of do a little bit of a deep dive as to why I don't like it, because I wanted to kind of think about why it was that I didn't like The Wall. So I split this into parts. Let's get into part one. Part one, it's a Roger Waters project, not a Pink Floyd project. Musically, thematically, lyrically, this is a Roger Waters project. It's not a Pink Floyd album. Those songs that Pink Floyd the band plays on are the highlights, and these are the ones that people come back to. Young Lust, Run Like Hell, Comfortably Numb. These are the ones that David Gilmour helped write. This is where Nick Mason and to the point Richard Wright is on it. I mean, Richard isn't really found on this, and he didn't want to really contribute too much to this album, and he was partially kicked out, partially left. I mean, even on the tour, he wasn't actively a part of Pink Floyd at that time. They had hired him on as a musician because most of the music found on it, like 90%, is straight up Roger Waters, which is so strange because there's a lot that's being led by the piano work. Because this is a major like Roger Waters project, it is also kind of a semi-autobiographical work as well. And this isn't inherently bad, but it does kind of lead me to my next part. Part two, the music isn't consistent. Some of the tracks on here are brilliant. As I've already mentioned, tracks like Run Like Hell, Comfortably Numb, Young Lust, even some of the ones that are strictly Roger Waters, Another Brick in the Wall, Part 2, Mother, Hey You. These are staple Pink Floyd tracks, and ones that I love in isolation. And it's weird, because I love these tracks in isolation, but that's not how you listen to Pink Floyd. You don't listen to Pink Floyd music in isolation. You listen to it in the context of the album. For some, like Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, the lead-ups that we have, right? Like Another Brick in the Wall Part 1 and Happiest Days of Our Lives, they build into Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, but they build and build and build, and when Another Brick in the Wall Part 2 starts, it almost starts in a flat, like it drops a little bit. And I'm not sure if I kind of like that within the context of the album. And this isn't the only time that happens. Now, I will admit the buildup that we have to Comfortably Numb with Is There Anybody Out There, that really built itself up, and then it goes straight into like this crescendo of Is There Anybody Out There, and then boom, dun, dun, psh. So you have those like really strong moments, but then you have a lot of kind of bland stuff, and even though the bland stuff is still really good, like I mentioned, Waiting for the Worms, Goodbye, Blue Sky, Mother, these tracks being very somber and very light, it makes a very like disjointed listen, and maybe that's the point, but there are a lot of times when you're just with Roger Waters and not with the rest of the band, and I feel like this does a little bit of a disservice to the rest of the band. As I said, this could work if it was more of like these smaller moments that Roger Waters was going towards building up, like we had with that build up of Comfortably Numb, but I don't know, like the build up for Empty Spaces and What Shall We Do Now, by the time we get to Young Lust, now I know that there should be another track between those, but when we get to Young Lust, I'm just like, wait, what is this now? Why are we, because we had such a great buildup with Empty Spaces and What Shall We Do Now, that when we get to Young Lust, it's just like this, what? And I know that they cut the song out between those two tracks, but still, it feels like it's a 180-degree shift, because Young Lust is very much a David Gilmour track, which is a stark contrast to all of the Waters music that we've gotten up to that point. And we also have this really weird build-up to Comfortably Numb from Bring the Boys Back Home. And I'm going to get a little bit more into that a little bit later on. And It's not just the music that's inconsistent, and that brings me to my third point. The story narrative is too episodic and choppy. This is a concept album, and it is a narrative album as well. It follows a character throughout their days of their life, very similar to, say, Tommy or The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, where there's a protagonist and they go through a number of things. And from a narrative standpoint, it is extremely scattered. It's very episodic. And in some ways, this could work, like Tommy is episodic, but it jumps a lot in time, and there's a lot of gaps. I do appreciate that each side of the album is a different chapter of this particular chap's life. First side is his childhood. Second side is like young adult. Third side is him being completely isolated and almost retreated into himself. And the fourth side is him finally breaking free. But I feel like in the episodic tracks, they don't flow all that well. There's too much jumping around in time. There's no clear idea of where he is. And especially within the story, they don't directly tell you what's going on, and you almost have to look at the liner notes and even do some research to realize that young Lust, at the end, you find out that he's, sleeping on the road as he's touring, and his wife is at home kind of doing the same thing. The narrative style and the narrative story is kind of all over the place, and they're introducing a lot of different things. And this actually brings me to the next point, which I'm going to go a little bit deeper in. Part 4. It's very scattered and all over the place thematically. Now, as I mentioned, if the story is all over the place, the actual themes and images are also all over the place. And it doesn't start off that way. Like, it starts off very, very solid with the figure of the mother and the figure of the school teacher being very imposing characters. And so we have a very crystal clear theme about that, of this overbearing schoolmaster and the overprotective mother. But once we get past that and we get into the wife character, it kind of just, I don't know where it goes. And it really needs to be tightened up a little bit more in terms of the metaphors and the imagery. Within the actual concept of the album, this rock star who is isolating himself, there's a lot of rich soil to really dig down and find some gold, some nuggets worth of musical interludes that you can really play with. And I feel like they shine the spotlight very odd and very scattered. We're bouncing around from the school years to the parents to fame to love and to war and everything kind of all in between, and it doesn't really give you enough time for any of these one things to sink in. Like, I would really love to see how the effects of the relationship with the mother character impacts how he felt with the wife character. They do introduce the wife character, but they don't really give her any time until the very end. We don't get that moment with the wife. We don't see it from the wife's point of view. How is this character pushing the wife character away? We don't get how he deals with the fact that he doesn't have a father, and how does that blend into the rest of his relationships. And we do get a lot of that within a lot of the images of war and how he's retreated, but I want to know, like, why? Where are those things coming from? What's going on with this? And that kind of leads me to a really big part of this. Part 5. What is up with all this war? And seriously, I need to actually, like, pinpoint, like, this might be one of my main issues with this album, is that there's a lot of anti-war sentiments to this. And I think this could work. I think this could work if it was handled properly, but it goes from, does anybody ever remember Vera Lee, like that track of Vera? And then out of nowhere, it just comes up with this Bring the Boys Back Home. And like, this is kind of like a pinpoint focal of why The Wall doesn't work for me thematically, why it doesn't work for me musically. This very, very heartfelt track of Vera, and then it just bleeds right into Bring the Boys Back Home. The only thing that I can think of, because I was thinking about this quite a bit, is Bring the Boys Back Home, is it like getting him back home? Like, is it actively saying to this character of Pink, which never actually comes up that his name is Pink until you watch the movie. I'm going to get to that in a little bit. Is it for him to be brought home? But the way that it's been presented, especially with the marching band and the overall gusto, and whenever Roger Waters plays this live, it's very much an anti-war sentiment of bring the boys back home. Don't send them off to war, bring them home. Is that what they're kind of saying? Like, is he saying that this isolation is a war within one's mind and you need to bring them back home? And does he go back home? But at this point, it does bleed right into Comfortably Numb, and we do see that he can't leave because he's found himself into this comfortably numb aspect. So, I don't know. I feel like all this war metaphor, it wasn't handled all that well. And I don't feel like it really adds anything to the story. It doesn't add anything that we've already mentioned before. Outside of the cause that it has led this main character's father's death and demise, I don't know. The whole time I was sitting there being like, why is this here? Especially when it's handled so much better in the final cut, the album that precedes this album. Like, they're able to focus in on the war aspect in the final cut, that it almost undermines what it's doing on this album. I think this also leads itself to point 6. It's super angsty and full of itself. Now, I get it. And I do love a good angsty album. I mean, I was a teenager in the early 2000s, so I get being angsty. And I do understand that it's supposed to be super personal to the point of being uncomfortable. It's very vulnerable in that sense. And when you're met with that vulnerability, you're going to get that angst, that kind of raging against it, being like, this is me and I don't like it. You're meeting somebody at their most vulnerable and watching them create this wall of isolation for self-preservation, and that leads individuals to be very open and exposed. But this also opens them up to, well, you think you have it bad, you don't really have it all that bad, and you don't even really know how good you have it. Like, you're a multi-millionaire rock artist. Like, I do know that the band itself at this point was going through some financial troubles, but they were still doing what they loved. They were still artists that were making money. They were one of the biggest bands of the time. Why would you say how much that sucks? Especially for a lot of bands that were just trying to get noticed. And here they are being like, the rock star life is crap and I don't like it and meh. And I felt like that presentation in such a large scale is not the greatest, and I think this was one of the disservice when it became semi-autobiographical in that sense, because we can almost see right through the facade and see Roger Waters' face underneath it all. Because the idea, as I've mentioned before, and what I'll go back to time and time again, the idea of an artist getting famous and then building a wall for self-preservation and isolating themselves from their fan base is brilliant. I think this is a brilliant idea, but I don't know if the execution of this was done very well, because it is so much full of angst. And I think out of all these, this one might be the most me problem, because I think I'm reading into it a little bit more on this one, but it is a little bit on the hard side to take it seriously when it is being so pretentious. And that kind of brings me to the final point. You need to watch the movie and the live materials to fully get the wall. In and of itself, it is a wall, because you're only getting half of the story if you're listening to the studio album. You need to experience the live versions to see the spectacle of the wall being built and the band actually playing behind it, with all the supplemental materials, such as the movie, bringing it more to life. So you have the tour, you have the movie, you have the subsequent live performances that just Roger Waters does. And each one brings a new piece to the construction of the wall. And when I listen to the studio version, it's very cold and very lackluster, and maybe that's the point. But when you listen to the live performances, there's a much bigger sense of energy. There's a bigger sense of sound. It's much more well-rounded. It's much more a cohesive whole in that sense. It's particularly true for the smaller moments. Like, it's totally true for the bigger moments. But the smaller moments allows it to really sink into the concept of this artist isolation with the audience, especially when you see that wall separating the band from the audience. And the studio recording mixing feels isolating itself. And again, that might be the point. But when I listen to the studio version of the album, it just feels like it's lackluster and it lacks the heart and energy that the live performances bring. Like, I have the box set of Is There Anybody Out There? And that's one of my favorite performances of The Wall. And I also really like Roger Waters' live DVD that I believe he put out in 2015, where he goes and tours The Wall with a bunch of studio artists and breathes the full life of The Wall into existence, that I feel like the studio work doesn't really do all that much. And I also feel like the studio album should work as an overall whole and stand on its own merit, and you shouldn't need all these extra adjunct items to enjoy it to its fullest. And that kind of brings it back for me as well. In conclusion, I can understand why people love The Wall. You know, I can definitely see the artistic merit, and I appreciate The Wall. People can identify with pretty much any aspect of this work. And the concept of The Wall, as I mentioned throughout this whole thing, is brilliant. You know, we have walls for self-preservation. There's a reason why people build walls and why we have boundaries for everybody. And ironically enough, it's almost the love and enthusiasm that people have for The Wall that I also feel kind of isolated from this wall. I feel like that's my own little wall bridging myself from the wall itself. Like, it's so weird because, you know, back in high school, everybody was tripping over themselves to love The Wall. If you knew Pink Floyd, you knew 2 albums. You knew Dark Side of the Moon, and you knew The Wall. And I love Dark Side of the Moon, but The Wall just never really did it for me. And when I saw my peers gushing over The Wall and loving The Wall, but mainly only for a couple of those tracks, like Another Brick in the Wall Part 2 and Comfortably Numb, it was furthering this divide between myself and my peers, because I would come to them when they started talking about Pink Floyd and gush about Atom Heart Mother. I would gush about The Division Bell. I would gush even about Saucer Full of Secrets. And they would think that they were unlistenable, they were boring, and it created this further divide. And maybe that kind of clouded my judgment as well. Not being able to connect, not being able to reach out, and I was almost banging on my own wall, screaming, is there anybody out here that appreciates Atom Heart Mother the same way that I do? And this wall being this beacon that drew the fan base like moths to a flame away from the conversation that I wanted to have about some of these other albums. In the end, I have grown to appreciate The Wall, as I mentioned, and I've begun to see the artistic merit of the album. But in my mind, it's still not their best work. So that's about it. That's my whole take on The Wall and why I'm not a really big fan of it, at least when compared to others, and why people love it. What did you guys think? Where does The Wall fit within your enjoyment of Pink Floyd? Do you love it? Do you hate it? I know for a lot of my friends that I talk to, they hate The Wall. It's their least favorite album. But for many others, it's one of their absolute favorite albums of all time. So I want to know what your thoughts are about this album. Let me know by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.